Hey everyone, we are going to be jumping into the best practices for forms. Before we can actually get into things like other components like inputs, advanced inputs, buttons, we need to talk about forms as a whole. Personally, I think that's just the better approach. Now, forms essentially replace the conversations we have with each other. So when you design a form, you should always keep in mind that they should feel like a friendly conversation between your user and the product. So let's jump in. Now, number one, the number of questions in a form. Let's take a look at this version over here. This is a lot for a user to take in. Over here, we have a form. It's super long and it's kind of demoralizing. When creating a form, we need to keep it as short as possible and only ask the questions that are absolutely necessary. Remember that if there are some optional inputs that absolutely need to be there, we should mark them as such and avoid using an asterisk. If some inputs are optional, do you really need those inputs at all? That's a question you should really ask yourself. Asterisks, they also muddy your design a bit and they create a bit of visual noise. So I would really think about using them. Here, let's take a look at how this has been fixed. So I just have used the full name, email, and password rather than having just a first name and last name. Sometimes from a development perspective, we need to have those two fields just split out due to the data structure. But do we really need to ask for things like your country or your phone number? Definitely optional. The next option is the order of questions. Remember what we said about making your forms conversational? Yeah, they should also logically flow like a conversation. What is the first thing you ask a person when you meet them? Their name, right? You wouldn't ask for their address or credit card information first. We should definitely start with their name and then move on to some more sensitive questions. Let's take a look at this version. Full name, email, address, then your credit card number. You're kind of easing into it here. The next best practice is categorize if you need to. Sometimes you may be tasked with building long flows or just long forms. That happens. It could be for a long registration form or inputting your taxes. A big no-no is to have all those inputs grouped together like this, because we run the risk of confusing our user. The solution? Try to categorize relatable information like I've done on this side. We have our payment method over here, and then we've brought out the billing information. Some flows will get long and you can only break them down so far, but this is much better than this version over here. Next, let's think about layout. Now, yes, layout applies to your forms as well. We have all been guilty of this. Including me when I was first starting out. Forms should always be arranged from top to bottom in a single column so it's easy for a user to read. We typically read from top to bottom and left to right, and this implementation makes me wonder in which direction I should start to fill out inputs. Should I start up here? Should I start up here? It's adding a layer of unnecessary complexity. Instead, just stack them. Let's talk about buttons. Okay, this is a big debate. And I don't really sway either way in terms of the placement of your buttons at the end of the form. Some people will argue that buttons should be left aligned to a form because we logically read from top to bottom, left to right, meaning that the button will be right there waiting for you at the end of the form. But sometimes when you think about how we think about forms and proceeding to the next step, we generally think moving right is the next step and left is for going back. So generally, I will, it really depends on the form. I will usually go on the right side. Others I've seen it actually more prevalent now. So I've been trying it out a bit. It really depends on your type of form as well. So simple modals or something like that, I wouldn't mind putting on the left. But when we're talking about like having back buttons, having the back buttons swapped around is hard. Another scenario is that You may have two buttons like I've just mentioned, right? Like you have a submit and a cancel. And we have to make sure that both buttons are easily distinguishable to avoid the possibility that a user clicks the wrong button. You can easily do that with a secondary button. You should do your best also to add microcopy wherever possible and be descriptive with your button names. We'll get into that a bit later. But what I've done here is I've put the primary button on the left side and the secondary on the right, so it flows more naturally. So you have your create account and then cancel. So that does look really nice. And I wouldn't mind putting the button here, but if you're going to, follow one type of just practice, keep it consistent. Okay, this one is big. Progress. Remember how we just covered long inputs and broke them into different categories? I kind of mentioned this a little bit there. Sometimes forms are so long that you need to split them into different pages entirely, which is entirely logical. You don't want a user to infinitely scroll on one page to fill out a super long form. Also on mobile, we may treat long forms differently and have users go to separate pages to fill out. When you do this, you need to let the user know where they are within that flow and how much longer they need to go within that flow. This can be done in a variety of ways. There's progress bars, percentages, and even step counters. Let's take a look over here. So just like progress with percentage is an option. I generally don't even put the percentage sometimes. Like I'll use a combination of methods. We have over here, just like the step and a progress. So like this is like a state that's been, or you're currently in, and these are the upcoming states. And then we have like this step 1 of 3. So sometimes I'll use like a whole progress bar and then, use something like this where it's like, hey, step 1, step 2. So they don't need the exact percentage just to know how many more steps are left, because, even the exact percentage can be a little misleading. And that's it for the best practices for forms.